So our next speaker is Michael Wimsatt. Mike is the Director of the Waste Management Division for the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. He is responsible for solid waste management, compliance, emergency response, waste site cleanup, and administration of the Drinking Water and Groundwater Trust Fund. A warm virtual welcome. Please join me in a warm virtual welcome to Mike Wimsatt.
Good morning. Thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I will try to share my screen and see how that goes. Good. So you're seeing that? Okay, great.
We do see it, Mike. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. So are you seeing it in, for some reason it's not displaying on my screen the same as it was before, but are you seeing it in presentation mode or from?
It's not in presentation mode yet.
Okay, hold on, let me fix that. There.
Now it is, thank you.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. I have a presentation I want to give. It's a little briefer, I think, than Paula's was. I'm really focusing primarily on, disposal, the flow for waste that's disposed in New Hampshire, specifically with respect to landfills and with some mention of waste energy, which is we do have one facility in that regard. So I'll be presenting this, and I think we'll have plenty of time for questions. And while the focus of my presentation may be, relatively narrow here, I'm happy to field questions on anything that comes to mind. So in New Hampshire, we have about 7 facilities that between landfills and waste to energy that manage the waste in New Hampshire, that handle the ultimate disposal of waste in New Hampshire. And if you look at this slide, I'd first direct your attention to the orange diamond facilities. Those are limited service landfills, so they're important to our overall management of waste in the state, but they're less. They have less of an influence on flow than the commercial facilities that have an unlimited service area. So we have the Nashua Four Hills Secure Landfill, which takes waste only from the city of from within the boundaries of Nashua. We have the Lebanon landfill, which is a little bit of a hybrid. It certainly takes waste from the city of Lebanon, but also does accept waste from a few Vermont communities and from some additional communities in New Hampshire. So it's a limited service area, but it's not limited to just Lebanon. And then the Lower Mount Washington Valley landfill in Conway, which takes waste from Conway, North Conway, and I believe a couple of additional towns. So then the commercial facilities that really have most influence on how waste flows and on imports that occur are starting from the north, the Mount Carberry landfill in Success. And that it's a point of interest that landfill was originally, its first construction was associated with the paper mill that has operated for decades up in Berlin. And at a time when that paper mill transferred hands, that landfill property was carved off, and the Androscoggin Valley Regional Refuge District was formed. And I think it's about 9 communities in northern New Hampshire that own and operate that facility. And that facility, in addition to taking their waste, is also operated commercially, and it has an unlimited service area, so it can take waste from anywhere. And then the NCES landfill, operated by it's a division of Casella in Bethlehem, New Hampshire, is a commercially operated landfill. And again, the story with a lot of these landfills is they start out as the origins of that landfill. It was a very small landfill originally operated very locally, and then was acquired. There's been a few acquisitions, but eventually Casella acquired it and has been expanded and operated as a commercial landfill. And then last of all, to the south, the Turnkey landfill in Rochester, operated by Waste Management, Inc., is our largest landfill. Again, history on that landfill is that it originated as a small landfill and when was acquired and was expanded over time. And then our sole waste to energy facility in New Hampshire right now is operated by Wheelabrator Concord. That's in Pennacook, which is a village of Concord. So it's within the city limits of Concord. So that gives you an idea of the sort of geographic spread and the nature of the facilities that we have in New Hampshire. So getting to, I think, the real focus of today is, how much do we generate, how much do we dispose of, and where does it come from, and how much of it is imported. So the total tonnage managed by those 7 facilities that I just described was just over 2 million tons in 2019. And of course, these numbers vary from year to year, but I think 2019 is a reasonably representative year. And it's the year for which we have, it's the most recent year for which we have data that we can present. So that's why we've selected it. So of that 2 million tons, the New Hampshire sources represented about 1.1 million, or about 56%. And then the tonnage from out of state was around 884,000 tons. And that represents about 44% of the total tons disposed in the state. So how do we break that down? So the imports by state, as you can see, Massachusetts by far is the most significant importer of waste to New Hampshire at about 86% of that 884,000 ton. Maine, and I took note from Paula's presentation of the numbers that were reported for exports, and I want to very quickly point out that Paula, I'm sure, was giving you the very best information that she had available. All of us who work in this area know that getting accurate information about how waste is generated, where it's generated, and where it goes to is very difficult, because even if you have robust reporting requirements, depending on how and when the waste is shipped, whether it goes through a transfer station or whether it goes through an entity that needs to report to New Hampshire, it's very difficult to get accurate numbers, particularly when it comes to import and export. So the information that we have received, and this would come from the facilities themselves that report on where their waste comes from, suggests that we've received about 62,000 ton from the state of Maine in 2019 for disposal at these facilities. And that would represent about 7% of the total imports of waste to New Hampshire. Connecticut comes in at a little less than half of that, about 3%. Vermont also about 3%, and Rhode Island 1%. In New Jersey, that's on here. It represents 12 tons, so that might have been one project, one soil project or something like that. I'm not sure what that was, but obviously not particularly significant in the context of our overall imports. And you'll notice the note here, these percentages are approximate. It's also the case that for Wheelabrator, we did not have a state-by-state breakdown for the waste imports that came to the Wheelabrator incinerator. So these numbers can shift a little bit, but I think this gives you a general sense for what the proportions are when it comes to the various surrounding states. So, well, I want to go back to that and make one comment too. And that number really stands out for Massachusetts, and it's important to understand that Massachusetts has been pretty aggressive in limiting expansion of landfills and limiting overall the expansion of solid waste facilities in the state. So as a result, there are a lot of Massachusetts generators of waste that seek outside sources for disposal. And certainly New Hampshire, received, 740,000 tons. It's also the case that a lot of waste is being shipped out of Massachusetts to the states to the west, including as far as Ohio and Pennsylvania. So I think everybody on this call knows that waste is very much a regional commodity. It ends up going a lot of different places, and the differing approaches that states use and the differing limitations that can impose can really have a significant impact on import and export and the flow of waste. So I want to talk a little bit about those imports and how they break down by the facilities in New Hampshire. So of that 884,000 ton that was disposed of in New Hampshire from out of state, significant portion of that, the majority of it went to the Waste Management's turnkey landfill in Rochester. And I want to just explain that when you look at the percentages on the right here, that's not the total percentage of waste disposed in the state. That's the percentage of waste disposed at that particular facility. So what that's representing is that that number represented for 2019, and these numbers can fluctuate quite a bit in a given year depending on how a facility is operating and a lot of market forces. But for 2019, that 728,000 ton at turnkey represented 63% of the waste that was landfilled in that facility for that year. And again, that number has fluctuated quite a bit and can be very different from year to year. The NCES landfill disposed of about 74,000 ton. So not a really significant portion of the imported waste in the state that year, but it did represent about 25% of the waste that was disposed of at the NCES landfill for that year. And then Mount Carberry imported 51,000 tons from out of state. And for them, that represented about 22%. And if you look at, obviously geography is very important here. And if you look at, where Mount Carberry is located, a lot of the waste that would have been imported and come into Mount Carberry was likely from, northern states. And we'll look at a breakdown of that in a moment. And then the Wheelabrator facility took in about 18,000 tons of imported waste. And they process about 200,000 ton of waste a year. So that represents about 10% of their annual waste intake for 2019 was imported waste. And then the Lebanon landfill, again, it's a smaller limited service area landfill, but it does include several towns in its service area that are in Vermont. So more than likely that 11,000 ton for Lebanon would represent Vermont waste. And that represented about 1/4 of the waste that the Lebanon landfill received that particular year. And then again, as I mentioned, Nashua and Conway are limited service facilities that only have New Hampshire towns within their service areas. So they did not have any imported waste reported. So if we look at that by, how the export, or excuse me, if we want to look at exports, which we haven't been focusing too much on, but that's important. We did have about 184,000 ton of waste that was exported out of New Hampshire. And again, I put a caveat on these numbers because it's sometimes difficult to get this. If an individual generator ships waste directly out of state to an outside facility, we're not necessarily going to capture that information. So presumably this would be a floor. It would be the minimum amount that was exported, but there may well have been other waste exported that we just didn't get reports of because it didn't come through a facility that was required to report in New Hampshire. So about 184,000 tons exported. Of that, about 72,000 or a little less than half was MSW and construction demolition debris that was collected by transfer stations in New Hampshire. And of course, like a lot of states, the transfer stations in New Hampshire, we have a lot of transfer stations that are operated by individual municipalities that are publicly owned. We do have a handful of commercial transfer stations as well. And what we get reports from them that they exported approximately 73,000 tons out of state for disposal. The waste to energy facility in Concord used to dispose of its ash at an in-state landfill that had operated nearby. That landfill closed a number of years ago. And so now the ash that is generated there, about 50,000 ton, is actually exported out of New Hampshire for disposal at a Massachusetts landfill. And then residuals from C&D processing facilities, about 62,000 tons were exported out of the state for disposal. So if we break down, of the waste that are disposed in the state, I think it's always helpful to talk about, how does that break down in terms of waste type? And about 60% of that is MSW. About 16% is C&D. So we do have a significant amount of C&D that is being disposed of in the state unprocessed in landfills. And then about 4% is wastewater treatment plant sludge, about 5% asbestos, 70% industrial, which is kind of just a general category for industrial process waste that are disposed of. This wouldn't represent necessarily typical, office and plant trash from a facility, but rather industrial waste that are associated with the manufacturing process that need disposal. And then contaminated soils, a significant portion of the weight, 8%, which is not insignificant, is contaminated soils that come from sites that need to be cleaned up and for which there's just no other alternative for managing that soil. So as I said, I was really going to focus just on this flow of disposal and how the waste and exports and imports are distributed across New Hampshire's facilities. So I don't have any more to present, but I'm happy to field any questions that the folks have.
Great, thank you, Mike. First question, are there plans underway by other states to plan for legislative action that might restrict each state to be responsible for their own future waste disposition?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question? I just want to make sure I understand it.
Sure. Are there plans underway by other states to plan for legislative action that might restrict each state to be responsible for their own future waste disposition?
Well, I certainly, I can't speak for other states. I don't know what other states might be planning. I mean, I think that at some level, there's a lot of policy making going on in other states that does the opposite of that. It basically says, there's a lot of movement towards, to the extent that they're able to do it, limiting the expansion of certain kinds of facilities, some cases limiting certain technologies. And the result of that is that in some cases, it means that the policy measures actually have an influence of causing waste to be exported because development of facilities in those states is limited in a way that doesn't allow them to actually manage their own wastes. So that's not really what we're seeing. If you look at the imports we take in from Massachusetts, again, that is influenced by policies and limitations and waste bans that may be imposed in certain states. One thing I didn't mention on the C&D front, Massachusetts has a requirement that C&D cannot be landfilled unless it's first been processed. And so, as I think Paula said, access to processing facilities for C&D is limited across the region. I didn't mention it, but New Hampshire has 2 significant C&D processing facilities. And, a lot of what they take in is Massachusetts C&D that has to be processed. So, there's a certain amount of that, and I don't have the numbers for that today, but a certain amount of that, which is a really good end use, and Paula made mention of it, is where the wood portion of that, the higher quality wood portion of that is separated, processed, and then shipped. Unfortunately, we don't have much in the way of local uses for that wood. But the Tafisa facility in Canada is a MDF, medium density fiberboard facility that takes in that wood waste and really puts it to good use to make this medium density fiberboard. Unfortunately, the kind of facilities that do that are huge capital investments, so you don't see those everywhere. They tend to be really big and service a large area. And in our case, the closest one, as I understand it, is in Canada, and that's why that wood gets transported up there for use. Again, if I'm understanding your question, I think in many respects, what's happening with policy in a variety of states is the opposite of that. It isn't necessarily focused on, let's have policies that make sure we manage our own waste. It seems to be more focused on limiting options, and in many cases, that means that drives an export market in many states.
Great, thank you. Next question. With so much out-of-state tonnage coming into New Hampshire landfills, will New Hampshire open more landfills, particularly in the southern part of the state? If not, will New Hampshire limit the amount of out-of-state tonnage coming in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, there's a lot of concern. People get very concerned about imported waste, and certainly a lot of legislators and citizens have expressed concerns about the amount of waste that is imported to New Hampshire. I think it's important to understand that, you know, waste is really something that is managed regionally, and at some level, the state legislature in New Hampshire over many years has attempted to try to limit the amount of waste imported to the state. Some of its efforts to do that have run up against the Interstate Commerce Clause, where basically under that federal law, under that constitutional in the law provision and the laws associated with it, waste is considered a commodity that you can't restrict its flow from state to state, and there's certain legal limitations on that. What New Hampshire has done, which has had some, you know, I think positive effect and is good policy, is to develop this doctrine of public benefit. And that is to say that a waste facility that seeks a permit to operate in New Hampshire, in order to get that permit, needs to demonstrate that it will provide a significant public benefit to the people of the state. And so what that means, it has, to some degree in practice, it puts a little bit of a regulator on how much waste disposal capacity could be developed in the state. Because when a landfill comes to, you know, an application comes to the department to consider siting a landfill, whether it's a new landfill or an expansion of an existing landfill, the applicant needs to demonstrate through some very, you know, pretty specific language in the statute and the rules that it provides a public benefit. And one of the ways it has to do that is to show that the facility is needed and the capacity that the facility will provide is needed to provide capacity for disposal of in-state waste. So while, you know, a facility can still demonstrate a public benefit and still take in a significant amount of out-of-state waste or have a plan to do that, it also needs to make sure that it's going to provide significant disposal capacity that is needed for in-state waste. And if you look at it, you know, as it expands out, once you get to a point when there's basically a 20-year planning period that the facility needs to look at. We project out and they project out how much waste is going to be generated, what the in-state waste disposal needs are going to be. And then you need to demonstrate that if you look at all the facilities that are permitted and have permitted capacity in the state, is there a capacity need? So if at any given time, you've got a period of time, let's say you're going to operate a landfill for 10 years. If you project out 10 years and the state already has permitted capacity to address all the disposal needs for in-state waste during that time, the agency would not be able to find that there is a public benefit for that facility and it wouldn't get a permit. So it does have some kind of, to a degree, it has a limiting value on how much waste capacity could be developed for any given time, but it doesn't have the effect of just simply saying you can't have any imported waste.
Switching gears here to PFAS, do New Hampshire facilities that accept wastewater sludge require testing for PFAS?
We have, you know, when the PFAS, I mean, New Hampshire, I think, has been really a leader when it comes to responding to the PFAS problem. Back in 2014 was really when our sort of odyssey on that started. We had a significant supply well in Portsmouth, the Haven well that served Portsmouth's water system, and particularly the Pease Trade Port community and business community. Had a well that came up very high, tested very high for 2 compounds. Well was immediately shut down, and that sparked an investigation. But I don't think even then we realized what kind of a widespread problem PFAS were going to be. And it was 2 years later in 2016 when a manufacturing facility in Merrimack, New Hampshire, discovered that the water, actually it was a public water system that they had impacted that served their own facility, and they tested that and they found PFAS. And a lot of folks know the long story. You know, since then, that was about 5 years ago that discovery occurred. That facility, you know, impacted on the order of over 65 square miles of aquifer in southern New Hampshire. So we have been working, you know, earnestly and just intensively, and it has not let up ever since that time, trying to make sure that people had safe, clean drinking water. As many people know, we lowered our standards that existed then. You know, we set a standard back then, about 5 years ago, of 70 parts per trillion. And then this past summer, our standard was lowered to 12 parts per trillion and 15 parts per trillion, depending on the particular compound that we're talking about. So we just, you know, that whole issue has been for us a statewide effort at this point. As we started working on it and discovered the widespread nature of the PFAS contamination problem, we started looking in all different sectors, and landfilling and leachate was one of those sectors. And we did ask our facilities to sample their leachate for PFAS. And uniformly, we found PFAS contamination in leachate, which is, based on what we understand of the occurrence of these materials in commerce, that's not surprising. And so we've done a lot of work on that. I don't think we have a requirement that the sludges that go to a particular landfill be tested individually for PFAS. I think the commercial landfills that are accepting wastewater treatment sludges are commonly requiring that. They're doing so because they have an interest in understanding that in terms of how they manage their facility and how they manage their leachate generation and its quality. But we don't have a New Hampshire law that says that sludge has to be tested for PFAS when it comes in. Having said that, this isn't, an ongoing and an emerging topic. And, there's obviously, for good reason, a lot of concern on the part of the public for what is the quality of leachate. Most leachate ends up going to a wastewater treatment facility for treatment and disposal. So that issue is still an emerging issue that I think will continue to change over time. I know that some of our facilities have looked to do some treatment of leachate prior to shipping it off site, and have looked at various options for, trying to treat leachate for PFAS removal before it actually goes to a conventional wastewater plant, which really may not have any treatment technologies in their treatment train that effectively treat for PFAS.
Great, thank you. I know we're a little early, Kevin, but pretty much sums up the questions for Mike. So thank you, Mike.
Sure, pleasure.
Great, thanks, Mike.